is great to be here with you guys. Two of the smartest and most quotable people in the state of Israel. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. And welcome, everybody. We can't see you, so we have no idea if there's 7,000 people here or 7 people, which is probably good.
Yes.
Anyway, so I want to start with what seems like kind of the obvious question, but really the biggest question. So you've titled this book, Israel 2048, or I guess it's just called 2048, The Rejuvenated State. And, you know, we've just celebrated the 75th anniversary. And a lot of smart people have been asking if it's going to make it to 100. Will there be a Jewish and democratic state in the land in 2048 or not? And people are noting, you both are historians, of that, you know, there have been other times when Jews have controlled Jerusalem and the land, and they have not lasted 100 years. So I guess, and in the book, Ambassador Oren, you say, by all measures, the state should have dissolved years ago.
True.
We never should have made it this far. So I would love for each of you, and we'll start with you as the author of this book, to kind of lay the odds for us. Like, what's the chance that we're back here in 25 years having a centenary celebration, again, of Israel surviving as a Jewish and democratic state, presuming you think it is one right now? And what's going to need to happen to make that a reality?
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Opening
it's an
question.
Easy one.
An easy one. Softball question. First of all, Jodi, thank you for doing this. Thank you to the incomparable Susan Engel for making this happen, for Tammy, the making everything happen, Ben, my son Noam, everybody in the audience, my sister is here. Thank you, everyone who was not at my bar mitzvah. Thank you for being here. The assumption of this book was that Israel had, so far, not just a successful 75 years, but an outstandingly successful 75 years, because by any international criteria, Israel is not a successful country. Israel is a miraculous country. You know, whether it's been in terms of average longevity, and if you're an American Jewish male or American male, you want to live 8 years longer, you move to Israel. In terms of education levels, the fact that the water that comes out of your tap is better than anything you get in a bottle, that kind of thing. Infrastructure. But much of that success owed to the discussions that occurred within the Jewish world for the 60 years before Israel was created, from the 1880s to the 1940s. And as much as by the power of the sword, that state was created by the strength of words, by these discussions. And many of the institutions that have contributed to success, like our universal health care system, our university system, were the products of these discussions. And somewhere along the line, I know you're going to agree with me on that, sometimes we've lost the ability to think about our future. We're so bogged down in our daily controversies, and to have that type of open discussion. And we face many challenges. We're going to talk a lot about what's happening in Israel politically with the reforms, the democracy movement. But beyond that, there is the question of the ultra-Orthodox community. There is the question of the Bedouin in the south. There is the deep economic divide with 1 million children beneath the poverty level in Israel. The largest, by the way, social divide of any country in the world outside the United States, Chile, and Mexico. There are grave challenges facing the state of Israel. If we don't acknowledge them now and understand them now, and to begin to act on them now, then, to answer your question, Jodi, not only can we not be assured of, say, a second successful century after 2048, but we don't know if we're actually going to make that to 2048 in the same way. And, I'm an optimist. I don't think you can be an historian of Israel and not be optimistic. And even to have the experiences that we have had since moving to Israel, now, I'm 45 years in Israel, whether it be seeing 1 million Jews coming from the former Soviet Union, to see Israel opened up to the world, relations with China and India, the peace process. When I moved to Israel, there was no peace with Jordan and Egypt, much less the Abraham Accord countries. To see these things, to see, okay, miracles are possible, but we can't rely on miracles. We have to be proactive, and we have to understand, because all mobilization is predicated, first of all, on awareness. And that's what this book is about.
I mean, there's a lot of good statistics in the book. I would commend them to you. Some surprising, and including some of those OECD statistics that you kind of referenced. But if you zoom out from that, you just talked about Israel as this wildly successful country, and it doesn't feel that way right now. So, Yossi,
I'm not sure what country does, but okay.
But I'll ask you to pick up, Yossi, and about how it feels to you. I know you've been, quite engaged in the protest movement and deeply concerned about what's going on. So, how do you? What's the chance that we make it to 2048? What has to happen?
So, well, first of all, I just want to say how thrilled I am to be doing this with you, Michael, and Jodi, how much I appreciate your doing this with us. This, for me, is repaying a kind of karmic debt. 10 years ago,
10 years ago,
Michael joined me in the release of a book that I had published in October 2013, and now here we are with 2048. Just the title itself gives me pause. Really, it's a statement of faith and optimism, as is the fact that what you have in this book are 3 languages in one cover. It's in English, Hebrew, and Arabic, and I don't know of any other book that has done that. And that in itself is a statement and a vision for
Which also means
2048.
it's quite short. It's only a third of this size, whichever language you're reading it in. So it's really I discovered this while I was reading it on the plane home. It was quite exciting to discover. So it's quite short.
I just want to practice your Arabic.
Before you continue, Yossi, I just wanted to say the book Yossi is talking about is Like Dreamers. His history, he traces the history of Israel through the paratroopers who liberated, or whatever verb you might want to use, the Western Wall in 1967. And it is brilliant. So I want to commend that book to you, but I'll let you continue now.
Thank you. It's about 50 times
longer than this book.
It is a lot longer.
So read this.
And it's got a happy ending.
Maybe.
Look, I hear you, Michael, and obviously a part of me feels that as well, and a part of me is permanently celebratory for what we've achieved. But in the last months, the emotion that is strongest for me is dread. And Jews carry this fear of ourselves, of our self-destructive potential. It's built into our DNA. The story that we have told ourselves for 2,000 years of how we ended up in exile was it was our own fault. We didn't blame the Romans. The Romans were this kind of indifferent storm. We were the ones who destroyed ourselves. And so we carry in us this fear of ourselves, of our own self-destructive potential. And this is a moment in Israel where, it's like things were going too well for the Jewish people. We startup nation, we one immigration wave after another. Israel we were finally getting used to the idea of our own permanence. It took many, many years for me to settle into the radical idea that I don't have to fear for the physical existence of Israel.
This is a breakthrough analysis of politics. The whole Israeli politics can basically be explained by 2 Jews, 3 synagogues.
No, it's not. We have a national book. Most national books have Ulysses, Gilgamesh, they're books of triumph. Our national book is a book of defeat.
Yes. Spiritual failure.
Everything,
Yeah.
We blew it twice. And the question is, are we going to blow it a third time?
And that's the fear that I've been carrying these last months. And you feel it on the streets. The demonstrations are really, on the one hand, some of the most uplifting Israeli experiences that I've had, where you feel you're surrounded by hundreds of thousands of people who care desperately for Israel, who love Israel, who would do anything to protect Israel. And this feeling that I certainly have had, and many of my friends have had, that this is a kind of civilian equivalent of reserve duty. We're defending the long-term viability of Israel. Modern, successful startup nation, the Israel that you were just describing, is under existential threat from within. And that's what makes this moment so terrifying.
It's very different than what the protests we knew in the 60s, because we're both product of the same era in American politics, where people would get out and burn American flags and spit at soldiers and call America with a K. These protests are protests out of love. There's immense outpouring of love. People singing Hatikva.
And the symbol of the protest movement is the Israeli flag. You know,
that's extraordinary.
Here, if you would have a liberal opposition movement, there wouldn't be thousands of American flags flying, unfortunately, which is really a problem when one side of the political debate appropriates the national flag.
Right.
And in Israel, it belongs to all of us.
So let's talk about the meat of this controversy, these protests, the judicial reform, the judicial overhaul, some call it anti-democratic legislation. You wrote this book in 2020, I think, right?
Thereabouts, yeah.
And it includes a chapter called Judges in Jerusalem, where you say that there's a real problem with the judicial independence question, and you call for two big changes. One is a change in how judges are selected,
Indeed.
And the other is a change in the Supreme Court's ability to review legislation passed by the Knesset.
The scope. It's not necessarily has to do with the Knesset. It has to do with, let me explain. We take 2 steps back. Why did I write this in 2020? I was working on this in Knesset. I was working on judicial reform in Knesset. Most people here are citizens of the United States. You have not one but 2 opportunities to influence the composition of your Supreme Court. You vote for the president, you vote for the Senate. We in Israel have virtually no say about the composition of our Supreme Court, and that is why, in contrast to the United States, where the composition of the Supreme Court is a major electoral issue every time, in Israel no one ever asks. It's not an issue. And that is because the Supreme Court judges are chosen by a committee of 9, and on that committee of 9, the majority of the vote in that committee of 9 are either sitting jurists in the Supreme Court or other legal personnel. And as wonderful as our jurists are, they're also human beings, and quite naturally, if you're going to choose your successor, you're going to choose somebody who agrees with you, not someone who disagrees with you. And so in terms of its worldview, the Supreme Court was sort of marching in place circa 1994. The Knesset, as you knew, moved very far to the right, reflecting shifts in Israeli public opinion. And so the distance between them grew and grew and grew and became untenable. And increasingly, the Supreme Court was overturning pieces of legislation by the Knesset, and people in the Knesset were saying, well, we're going to pass an override law, which says that with 61 members of Knesset, which is the smallest majority you can have, we're going to override a ruling of the Supreme Court, in which case that's the end of judicial review, which I strongly believe is the pillar of any democratic society in the world, including this country. How do you then reform the Supreme Court in a way that preserves judicial review? And one was you change the way judges are chosen. That better reflects. I did not recommend that we adopt the American position entirely, because we have to preserve, because Israel is such a highly diversified society, we have to make sure there's an Arab judge or a Haredi judge, ultra-Orthodox judge. You can't do that if the Knesset is choosing all the people. So I did a dividing thing. The 15 judges, 8 are chosen by the government, 7 chosen by independent committee. Limiting the scope. The Israeli Supreme Court has the widest jurisdiction of any Supreme Court in the world. It operates under the notion that everything is adjudicable, kol shafit, which means like the position of this bottle on the table can be determined by the Supreme Court. And that was also untenable. So you have to limit the jurisdiction. None of this, by the way, was insurmountable. These are simple solutions to a complex question, but it was a matter of political will and political maneuverability, and that's the big question, whether in the negotiations now being held under the auspices of the president, whether these parties can actually agree to these type of compromises.
I guess the question is, how did what you're describing sounds kind of reasonable-ish. We grew up learning, whether from conjunction, junction, whatever. We learned about checks and balances, and we hold them quite dear. And most of us have learned about this judicial reform as the demise of checks and balances, or the demise of separation of branches of government. So how did we get from what you're describing sounds kind of reasonable to what feels to Yossi and hundreds of thousands of people on the streets and many American Jews like an assault on democracy? And I guess, Yossi, I'd ask you, is what Michael's saying in this book, and now, like, is it reasonable, and what happened? Because
Well, it's really interesting because Michael and I argue about these issues literally every day. I think that's fair to say, right? And my closest friend, and my sparring partner, and here we are on a stage, and I have to kind of do a switch.
No, it's good. It's good.
So,
it's good TV to spar and disagree.
So, look, I agree with you that there needs to be some adjustment. That's the delicate word I would use. And the reason I'm using such a cautious word is severalfold. First of all, because we don't have a constitution, we only have one parliamentary house. This is what we have. We have the Supreme Court to balance the power of the politicians. The threats to Israeli democracy, even leaving this government aside for a moment, are profound. They're systemic. First of all, we have an occupation that's going on for more than half a century, and you and I agree that this occupation is a disaster for Israel and that we have no choice but to continue the occupation for the foreseeable future, for security reasons, because we don't have a credible Palestinian partner, all the reasons that have been discussed for years, and you and I agree with that. Nevertheless, the ongoing occupation, to my mind, necessitates an activist Supreme Court. We need a strong, liberal, activist, interventionist court for that reason. The second reason is the overwhelming security threats that we face. There's no other country, well, maybe now except for Ukraine, that faces the kinds of existential threats that we routinely deal with. And inevitably, that weakens democratic norms. And I think the miracle of Israeli democracy is that we're struggling to maintain democratic norms in the middle of the kinds of threats that would have destroyed democracies for other countries. Nevertheless, we are facing ongoing threats to democratic norms. And the final threat to democracy is, here I'd be careful about using the word threat, but the strain on democracy is the fact that Israel was founded not as a state of its citizens. It was founded to deal with the problems of a world people, the Jewish people. And I believe that being the state of all of its citizens is compatible with being a Jewish state, but there's a strain, there's a constant tension in these two identities. And so when you put all of these issues together, for me, I can't imagine what we would be like with a weaker court. Now that's before we even get to this government.
Not a weaker court, it's a more circumscribed court,
Now,
not a weaker one.
Okay, so and where I do agree with you is that the court lost substantial amount of credibility within large parts of the Israeli public, and that's very dangerous for democracy. So yes,
we have the same problem here.
And so okay,
so we're going to get to here.
But okay, so
all this is going to sound very familiar to you.
So good. We need an adjustment, reform, call it what you will. Mm-hmm. What we're facing here is not a reform; it's a revolution. And I believe that it is only our protests that stop the government from doing the outrage of the judicial override, which would have destroyed Israeli democracy.
I don't disagree with the word he said, understand. What a deep concern I have, and maybe you can disagree with me on this, is what I call the Americanization of Israeli politics, which has been a growing sense among segments of the Israeli population that the outcome of the election is not acceptable. They're not legitimate elections. The government is not legitimate. Cancel culture, not letting people speak. And it's interesting, it's coming from different segments. In this country, the assault on the Supreme Court, the criticism of the Supreme Court, comes from the left, and in Israel it has come from the right. It's almost like mirror images of one another, what's going on here. The cancel culture in Israel is coming from different places too. And we have not had an insurrection, okay, with them in 75 years. I always say this. We say,
yes.
it's true.
We're closer than we've
I mean,
than
also
we've
that-
been.
We should
the
just give
lowest
the state of
fire.
Israel a little credit. We are one of maybe the 5 countries in the world that have never known a second of non-democratic governance. Okay, we're the only country on that list that's never known a second of peace, but we've never had a coup or attempted coup. We've never had a contested election. All right, we haven't had people saying we're not going to accept the government, and some of those governments were very controversial. Begin, 77.
We had in the last year and a half. We had
Until now.
The Bennett Lapid government was considered illegitimate by the right.
That's my point. You're making it started now. It started actually with the Likud saying that Bennett wasn't a legitimate prime minister. I agree with you. We don't disagree.
Netanyahu said the Bennett government is legal and not legitimate, which is what how I would describe this government of Ben Gvir and Smotrich. And,
Okay, I want to.
It's scary.
A couple things. Can I call you Michael? If I have to call you
What would you think
I don't
about
know. High honor.
I'm
or whatever.
partial to Doug.
Okay. Sorry.
What?
So you, Michael,
Yes.
referred very casually to these negotiations that are going on under the president's auspices,
Yes.
President Herzog, which, as though there are real negotiations going on that are going to yield some kind of compromise, which I feel is not my, I mean, that's the first time I feel like I've heard them referred to seriously, and I'm wondering if that was accidental or on purpose, and what you think, Yossi, as to whether, are there real negotiations that are going on that you think are going to yield some reasonable compromise here, or is this basic hardline proposal, mass protests in the street, going to continue until there's some kind of crisis that causes yet another election?
These negotiations remind me of the Oslo process, where
Which brought us peace. So
which
great.
brought us peace in our time, and the Oslo process was doomed from the beginning. You know, there's this a kind of a left-wing revisionist idea of why Oslo failed, which is that Rabin was assassinated, and if he had lived, Oslo would have succeeded.
Not true.
Absolutely not true. I don't know anyone in Israel, virtually, who believes that. And we chose the wrong negotiating partner. There never was a chance. And that's how I feel about this government. I'll say lahavdil, for those who understand the lingo. I will say lahavdil. I don't want to compare Netanyahu to Arafat. But in terms of the chances of a negotiation, of negotiation succeeding, this government has about as much goodwill on this issue as Yasser Arafat had in making peace with Israel. That's where I would make the comparison. So there's no chance. I hope, Michael, you'll be in a position to tell me, I told you so. You're pessimistic. You're always pessimistic. I really hope you'll be right.
No, actually more pessimistic than you are on this one, and I'll explain why. I come also from the world of politics, and a little bit, unfortunately, know how hot dogs are made. And I had a great guru once upon a time, Asher Aryan. Remember him?
Yes.
He was like the first Israeli scholar of Israeli politics, an American. And he's passed away. And I once asked him, I said, okay, on one foot, tell me, what is the one law of Israeli politics I have to know? And he said this: Israeli politicians will always prefer collective to individual suicide. And believe me, and we'll burn the whole place down. If I'm not going to get it, I'll burn the whole place down. And it's not just the government that is unwilling to compromise at these things. It's also the opposition, which has actually no interest in compromising because they're doing well by not compromising.
Right.
And you have Benny Gantz saying, I want to compromise, but actually in the negotiations he's not compromising because, listen, it's putting the government in a terrible situation. And Likud is hemorrhaging support because most of the people in Likud, as you know, also want to compromise. Many people in the Likud. So it's working to their benefit. One of the great changes, one of the dangerous changes in Israeli politics. Just one last point in this, and I know we agree on this, that one of the great changes in Israeli politics over the last couple of years is that for the first time in our political history, Israeli politicians, Netanyahu, yes, but not just Netanyahu, have chosen partisan political interests over the national interests. And whether it be the vote as extending Israeli law over the Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria, or which the Likud opposed, right, in order to bring down the government, or even voting down a piece of legislation that would have enabled the previous government, the Bennett government, to achieve the removal of the visa waiver, which I used to say to my staff in Washington, if we ever achieved that, they'd make a big statue to us in downtown Dizengoff Square. The Likud voted it down. And they did this, they put their partisan interests above state interests, but that's also what's happening in these negotiations.
I want to move on, but I feel like I have to ask you, I mean, you worked very closely with Prime Minister Netanyahu for 4 years? 5 years? 10 years.
Gray hair.
Why would he not want to compromise and get out of this mess and survive? Or another way of asking that question is, isn't the guy you worked for and the guy I covered 10 years ago not this guy? Because that guy, I think, would have compromised.
I'm not in daily contact with this guy, but he seems from the outside to be very, very different. First of all, he's much weaker. Now, I had the privilege /
So is that the answer? He doesn't want to
benefit of
compromise
serving
because
under
he's much
two
weaker?
different governments, two different Netanyahu governments, both of which are very stable, almost without any coalition crises. This is 2009, 2015, 2019. Really almost no crises, very stable governments. And this is one crisis after another because he's weak. Netanyahu always wants to be in the center of his coalition. He wants to have parties to the right of him, the left of him. Now he finds himself the leftmost person in his own coalition. And he has guns to his head, multiple guns to his head. He's got settler guns, he's got Haredi guns, he's got all different types of guns. And he has judicial reform. He's got a trial. Much weaker.
The suicide thing.
Much weaker. And I know that Jodi, you may not like this, but it would be in Israel's interest to have a much stronger Netanyahu than we have right now.
It would be in Israel's
interest. It would be, because I think that Netanyahu would always come out in favor of judicial review. It actually goes against his longstanding policies.
Well, this actually brings me to the next question, which is, we're sitting here like just a few blocks from where this parade was yesterday. And it was not like other parades, as you may have either seen or read. Protesters lining the route, Jewish organizations and rabbis shouting at Israeli ministers. And in many cases, those guys shouted back. We have this diaspora affairs minister who
giving the middle finger.
Maybe giving the middle finger. He seems completely uninterested in the diaspora, as far as I can tell. We have Simcha Rothman, who sponsored the judicial overhaul legislation, and now Netanyahu has hired as his media advisor a guy who thinks...
And then he wants to know why he's not invited to the White House.
Won the 2020 election and thinks Joe Biden is destroying America.
Yeah.
So I feel like one of the axioms, but you had your guy who told you the axiom of Israeli politics.
Yeah.
One of the ones that I think you two taught me was that the relationship with America is so important, that politicians cannot win elections unless they are believed to be people who will do well in Washington. Is that era over?
I have a lot to say about this, but
giving us the finger. I mean,
well, look, if you look at the polls in the last couple months in Israel, if elections were held today, this government would lose overwhelmingly. I've never seen. Maybe you have. I mean, I'm only in Israel 40 years, so I'm a newcomer. But,
a greenhorn.
A greenhorn. But I've never seen a government disintegrate in the polls as quickly as this government has. And I think there are many reasons for it. And one of the many reasons is the perception, the accurate perception, that Netanyahu is leading us into a kind of pariah status. And certainly the fact that the White House hasn't invited him has registered with the Israeli public. Israelis don't like that. They don't like, if we need to have a crisis with Washington for issues that we perceive as essential to our security, Israelis are ready to do that, but not over a judicial transformation. And Ben Gvir and Smotrich have underwhelmed the Israeli public. They have not been impressive, to say the least. And so, yeah, I think that this is, it's a coalition of scoundrels. That's not to put too fine a word on it, but we have never had, this is a coalition. It's not the question you asked, but I have to say it. It's a coalition that brings together the nationalist, the ultra-nationalist far right, religious fundamentalists, and the merely corrupt, which is the Likud. And that's, we've never had a government like this. And
This
so,
is how you know Yossi's not a politician. He acknowledges that he's not answering the question.
Right.
You have no idea.
It comes under it's like the first rule of with interviewing on CNN is that when they ask you a question, you say, that's a great question, but a better question would be.
actually,
the New York Times
Bibi is the master of that, isn't
You're the
he?
master of it. It's called bridging.
At the New York Times, when I first got there, someone taught me that if you wanted to get out of doing a story, you would just say, a smarter way of doing this.
Right, exactly. Let me just listen. The tremendous amount. We can talk hours about the U.S.-Israel relationship. You know, Bibi built himself up by standing up to Barack Obama. All right, and, there was no love lost there. I think the sense with Joe Biden is that Joe Biden is a genuine friend of Israel, and I know him quite well, and I know his staff quite well, and he is a genuine friend. And Israelis don't like seeing tensions between someone who they perceive as a genuine friend and not as a challenge. I see also a strategic danger, and I think Yossi would agree with me on this, that as we are approaching a head-on collision with Iran, we need always essential services from the United States. The first one is replenishing our ammunition stocks, which we always run low in every conflict we have. Who's going to provide what I call the diplomatic iron dome? Who's going to cast the veto in the Security Council when we're condemned as war criminals for going into southern Lebanon to get at Hezbollah missiles? Now, who's going to help us on the morning after? This is an administration that has stood up consistently against its own progressive wing to defend and say that Israel has a right to defend itself, really, under tremendous pressure. The progressive wing does not like the administration's position on Israel. You know, they haven't reopened the consulate in East Jerusalem. They haven't pressured on settlements. They really haven't. There is a certain segment of the Israeli population that acknowledges this, that appreciates this, and does not appreciate the fact that there's tension between our government and the White House.
So we skated over a little bit the occupation. I'm going to take us back there for a sec. In the book you write, Michael, you write, the land of Israel, every last millimeter of it belongs to the state of Israel.
Yes.
It's a bold and blunt
and the Jewish people
statement.
Mm-hmm.
And you go on to say that while Israel cannot be seen as occupying the West Bank because that land, in your view, belongs to the Jewish people. We can't occupy our own land, but you acknowledge that Israel is occupying another people, the Palestinian people, and should stop doing that.
I also say that we own every millimeter because the right, for example, of Tammy and me to live in Jaffa is the same right that someone has to live in Ariel or Beit El. We either have a right to the land of Israel or we don't. But I go on to say on the next page, that doesn't mean you have to actualize that right in every situation. You're not going to build settlements in downtown Ramallah and Jenin. And this, by the way, is the longest chapter in the book, has to do with the peace process, because I started 30 years ago in the Rabin years in the Oslo process, and I concluded being an advisor to the Trump peace plan. So I come with a perspective. I also participated in the last round of negotiations with the Palestinians, which was, I probably learned more.
You'll see in the book that Michael is the Forrest Gump of the Jewish people.
That's a lie.
I know that's your line, but I can't look at myself. But every chapter is like, when I was doing this important thing related to this tenant.
When I was sitting with Moshe Rabbeinu, and he was deciding whether,
that he was involved
Canada
with the
or Canaan.
Bedouin. Anyway,
but
that's the movie version. You'll be Forrest Gump.
But I also say that this should be also our position in negotiations. We should come to the table the same way the Palestinians come to the table. They say they own every millimeter too. We shouldn't come to the negotiating table and say, hey, you guys say you own it all, but we only own half. In the book, the longest chapter deals with the question of two states. And I have a lot to say about it. At a certain level, I think it's a moot point because there are two states. You go up Highway 6 and you see big Palestinian flags flying over Tulkarm and Qalqilia. There's a state there. It's not necessarily a Weberian sovereign state, but it's got a government, not standing for re-election. It's got a military of sorts that collects taxes, mostly at gunpoint. And it is the state. The question is, what is the territorial and juridical extent of that state? And what is our ability to defend ourselves against that state? That's a huge issue.
So I was gonna say that before you go, Yossi, I just wanted to share something you told me 9-10 years ago, which relates similar to what Michael wrote in the book, but you said it in this incredibly poetic way. It was at a moment during the Kerry negotiations, which most of us have forgotten, when President Abbas went on Israeli television to say he understood that he would never go back to Safed, which is where his family is from. And you said to me, you said that that was very meaningful to you, and that you understood that that was him giving something up, and that you appreciated the idea that he was personally giving something up and was asking his people to give something up, and that you believed, as Michael wrote, that the West Bank also belongs to the Jewish people and to you, and that you are eager to give it up for a two-state solution, but you want the Palestinians to acknowledge that you are also giving something up that you believe belongs to you.
Can I unpack that quote that I gave you?
Sure.
Because he just backtracked a couple weeks ago.
I just want to give you
He just took it back.
I want to give you a very different quote.
Okay, sure. I'm
Yeah,
happy.
first of all, exactly. Abbas
just took it back.
Look, Abbas walked that concession back a few days after he made it. And I remember feeling completely deflated. I was very moved when he was asked by an Israeli journalist, "You were born in Tzfat, Safed, which is in northern Israel, in the Galil. Does Tzfat belong to you, to the Palestinians?" And he said, "Tzfat is part of the state of Israel." He said, I hope that I will have the right to visit, but it's part of the state of Israel. There was such an outcry within Palestinian society that he felt impelled to walk it back, which of course, in that little story, it tells you everything that's gone wrong in Palestinian politics. But in terms of, I would not say that I'm eager to give up Judea and Samaria. And for me, as
Well,
for
you're
you,
eager to end the conflict, and
yes,
you know that it involves...
I would be prepared under certain circumstances. And I should just add parenthetically that for me, as for most Israelis, it's not the West Bank, and it's certainly not occupied territory. It's Judea and Samaria. And that's, no, wait. Before you applaud, there's more. There's more. Where I go farther than you would be willing to is I say yes, every inch of the land between the river and the sea belongs to the Jewish people. The problem is that it also belongs to the Palestinian people. No, stop.
No.
It's not a political rally.
I don't disagree with you. I think
the real
it's true.
question is, how do we get out of this mess? You both say
he's the
Israel will
politician.
not
I'm just
survive.
an analyst.
Israel
You have
will
to come
not
up with
survive
solutions.
with this status quo.
I don't say it as a politician. This is being involved in this process for 30 years at different levels, and it's this. You mentioned John Kerry, so I remember John Kerry's more gray hair. I used to say to John Kerry, I said, our problem is not that the Palestinians are not a people. Our problem is that the Palestinians are not enough of a people. There are thousands of peoples in the world. Very, very few of them are capable of sustaining a nation-state structure. In the last 140 years, I cannot point to any evidence. I cannot adduce a single shred of evidence that would suggest that the Palestinians are capable of sustaining a state structure. On the contrary, much evidence to the contrary. One of the great miracles, one of the great achievements of the state of Israel, you could take Jews from 70 different countries in the world who don't have a common language, don't have a common culture, stick them in a country with no natural resources, surrounded by adversaries. They're going to create a nation state, and a high-functioning nation state. You stick, Palestinians in Gaza, you're going to get Gaza. And that is a real problem for us. If they're more of a people, if they have more of that sense of cohesion, they could do much better. It's a problem. We could create a Palestinian state tomorrow, it's going to fall apart.
Michael, you might be right.
Yeah.
But we have the responsibility, if only to ourselves, to do everything we can
Absolutely.
to try to make a viable Palestinian state possible. And please, no applause from the left side.
Right.
What I look for in a Jewish audience is is nuance, is an appreciation of just how complicated and how heartbreaking the situation is. And it's so much beyond the left-right divide that that we really need to have serious conversations about what this is doing to us. And look, you know, for many years I've felt that we can't continue with the occupation. There must be a Palestinian state. And like Michael has just laid out, there can't be a Palestinian state. And so what do you do?
Well,
That's the tragedy.
So my son Noam is here, was in the Army in a Special Forces unit. We have my assistant Ben, who got injured battling protests in Judea and Samaria in the Nachal. We have to be able to look at these young people in the eye and say that we tried everything. Yeah. Because we're asking them to go out and risk their lives. And that's no small thing. But my point in the book is that as we keep beating our heads on the two-state solution, which is neither a solution, and the Palestinians actually have never accepted the American formula of two states for two peoples because they don't recognize us as a people. Look at Mahmoud Abbas's...
The Jewish people.
The Jewish people. They never accepted us as Jewish people. Look at Mahmoud Abbas's recent speech in the UN where he denied there's a Jewish people, denied there was ever a temple. There's no evidence at all that there was ever a Jewish temple. That's what he said to the UN a couple of weeks ago. No evidence at all. And, you know, we have to be able to look at there are alternatives. There's autonomy, there's trusteeship, there is cantonment. There are different ways you can approach this. I know even people in this administration are thinking the same thing. That we've been beating our heads on this formula for 30 years. Yes, this administration, for 30 years. It's not going anywhere. Nor is it going to go anywhere, not the least of which because of an Israeli government that's adamantly opposed to it. You have no Palestinian leadership. There's no one to negotiate on either side right now. So let's look at different ways that we can address the situation. Is it a solution? No. Is it a better way of managing? Absolutely.
Well, is it a way to preserve Israel as a Jewish
Yes, no
state?
question.
So I'm excited to report from the nuance front that we have some very good audience questions. So thank you for these. I'm going to turn to these. And you guys are so
We love
cute.
each other. We do.
We're going to get
We do.
back
Sometimes kill each
to
other.
you and your friendship in a second. But
Well,
I think this might be for Yossi. How can the democracy movement be fully inclusive of Arab citizens when, amongst other things, they may not be comfortable waving the Israeli flag? And of course, we've had many smart things written about the lack of Arab involvement.
Yeah.
So yes, thank you for the question. How could you and your fellow press...
The question, the dilemma is even sharper because some Arab Israelis want to come with Palestinian flags. And that's not really welcome in our demonstrations. Now, because we're liberals, nobody's going to tell them not to fly a flag. And you come to our demonstrations, you'll see there are a few Palestinian flags on the edges. And Netanyahu, in the early phase of the demonstrations, really went to town on these flags. He tweeted out, he said, here, this is the opposition, meaning that we're all traitors. And the grassroots response, literally the next week, was people showing up with thousands of giant Israeli flags, and that became the symbol. So the problem...
but frankly, this isn't just a problem of this movement. This is one of the fundamental problems in the book that's about the fundamental challenge of what Israel's going to be.
It is. Right. But what I find so moving and powerful about this movement is precisely that it is an uprising of the Israeli center. It's not an uprising of the left. The left is there, but there's very little left in the state of Israel. And instead, what you have, this is a movement that's led by soldiers. Every living former IDF commander-in-chief is part of this movement.
Yeah.
I believe there are 8 of them. Every former head of the Mossad, except for one, Yossi Cohen, is part of this movement, and even he signed the letter. Every former head of the Shin Bet is active. These are the people who speak every week around the country at demonstrations.
Well, and of course, the defense minister resigned.
I want to respond to the Arab issue. If I
can. So first of all, we have to own up to the fact, and proudly, that this is a Zionist movement. The language of this movement is Zionist. And that's so important because the government tried to de-Zionize us, to appropriate Zionism for themselves. We didn't let them do it. The dilemma here, and I understand why Arab Israelis would feel uncomfortable surrounded by thousands of Israeli flags. I find that heartbreaking, but I understand why they would feel uncomfortable. In the same way that I would not be part of a demonstration with massive Palestinian flags.
Again, this really is about the one of the core challenges of the state. I mean, you talk in your book, Michael, about how the importance of having Arab representation on the Supreme Court. But I know for me, it was one of the indelible lessons of these challenges to when to be a Supreme Court justice who doesn't stand for your own country's or doesn't say your own country's national anthem is like exposing the challenge at the core.
We have a third of our
country.
members of Knesset will not just sing the national anthem. Not just Arabs, there's also Haredim. A lot of people won't sing the national anthem.
Good. Well, then
imagine like a third of the
opportunity.
Congress not singing Star Spangled Banner.
Anyway, go quickly on Arab Israelis because the next question for you is
But I want to
really
go
good.
to, I want to express, respond to you and then respond to Yossi, okay, if I can. It's, one is that there's a chapter in the book that what I call the New Deal. And the New Deal is basically that the state of Israel has to declare as a national goal total equality between Arabs and Jews. And that means fighting, in a Churchillian sense, discrimination in the classroom and in the workplace, certainly in the halls of government. But there's the quid pro quo, that the Arab population of Jews and the Palestinian population of Israel has to acknowledge its legitimacy of a Jewish nation state and be loyal to that state. And I give many examples of the 194 nations in the world, majority are nation states. They have non-nation minorities who are very loyal. The good example would be Anglo-Jewry, which salutes a flag that has not one but three crosses on it, and sings "God Save the Queen" to the head, or the king now, to the head of the Church of England, and is willing to fight for that flag and die for that flag. Okay, so Israeli Arabs can salute our flag as well. So that's the New Deal, and I think that's one of the reasons I put the book, a third of the book, in Arabic, was just to show that hey, this is 21% of our population. We can't ignore them. They're part of our story. I talk about bringing the Arabs into the Israeli story, because every, of course, nation, we are a story, and our story has proven very flexible. We've brought Druze into our story. We've brought Circassians into our story, Ethiopian Jews into our story. There's room for the Arabs in our story, too. Now, to what Yossi's caught, and this is going to be a little bit edgy, and that is, we started off, I think the protests reached about 700,000 people. As of this week, they're down to about 150, a little bit lesser, because it's fragmenting in some of its goals. We cannot ignore the fact that even when 700,000 people were out protesting, there were 9.3 million people not protesting. And who are these people? They deserve a voice as well. We live in different places. I live in South Tel Aviv, and member of a community that is overwhelmingly Mizrahi. They see it completely different. They don't see it as a matter of democracy and rights and freedom. They see it as a battle over white privilege. That most of the people protesting, certainly in Tel Aviv, and I've seen the protests in Tel Aviv, are Ashkenazi, elite upper class, and they are rallying around the last bastion of Ashkenazi elite power, which is the Supreme Court. And they refuse to relinquish the power that they lost at the polls, which is to working class, traditional Mizrahi population. They see it in those terms. And,
Well,
the term, I know you disagree with that, but I hear this, I hear it throughout my building, I hear it throughout my neighborhood, daily.
I have
see it
always
completely
been
different.
sympathetic to that argument. I made Aliyah into the Mizrahi Revolution in the early 80s and very much identified with it. Mm-hmm. I feel that the Likud has manipulated this issue, has manipulated the ethnic issue, and this is at this moment, this is a contrived issue. What we're fighting for is whether modern, successful Israel is going to survive. And whether young Israelis who are part of the successful side of the state will feel that they have a future in the country. That's what this is about. There are Mizrahim who are part of this demonstration. Maybe it is a majority Ashkenazi, but you have a strong minority of Mizrahim who are part of this. If you look at the speakers every week, the speakers are heavily Mizrahi, also religious. You have religious Jews.
Okay, I got to move on.
And so, this is really for me, this is it's a contrived issue, and Michael,
Don't say that in my neighborhood. They may take offense at that.
Okay, but people have been manipulated by this government.
Okay, we have more good questions. And also, I need a time check.
Let's just keep going.
Okay, let's just
We're
keep
having
going.
fun.
Okay, as an
You guys are okay, we're okay.
This is a question from the audience. As an American Jew, how can I reconcile the idea of a vibrant liberal democracy with Israel's refusal to provide defensive weapons to Ukraine?
Ooh.
Particularly Iron Dome. This is a good
That's
question
for you, Mark.
That's
I know,
for
it's
me.
right up
So
your alley.
if you go on Israeli television, it's very different than American television. You go on Meet the Press here. It's my distinguished colleagues across the
We
aisle.
did a story together about that in 2014.
What was what?
Where you talked about when you were interviewed on American television and Israeli television.
Yeah, you go to Israeli television.
Different
You start to talk and everyone screams at you, and they curse you at live television. So this is now a year ago, last February, maybe a week after the invasion, Russian invasion of Ukraine. I get on Israeli television, a panel, and I said, Israel has to come out unequivocally on the side of Ukraine. It's a strategic interest for the state of Israel. It's a moral interest for the state of Israel. We are the Jewish democratic state, and how can we remain neutral, which was our position back then, while a fellow democracy, led by a Jew, was invaded by a totalitarian state. And it was also our interest, keeping our interest, the fact that we are part of the Western world. We're part of the enlightened free world. We are the ally of the United States of America. And some of our good friends here were very, very angry with us. And the reasons given, I didn't buy the reasons that were given. The reason was that we were afraid of the Russians in Syria, who enable our army and our air force to attack Iranian installations in Syria, and we're afraid the Russians would shoot at our forces. And I thought, well, listen, there are only 4,000 Russians in Syria. Now there's only 1,000. And we have an army that's more than twice as large as the British and French armies combined. The fact that we were broadcasting to our enemies that we were afraid of 4,000 Russian soldiers was a bad message. All right. Why are we afraid? Let them be afraid. So I was very adamant about it, and everybody screamed at me. How could you endanger Israeli lives? How can you care about the Ukrainians who were, this is the cradle of anti-Semitism in Europe? People assaulted me on the street, for saying this. What is it now, a year and a half later? I feel exactly the same. And I think that we'll have a reconcile. We will have to answer to history if we don't come out squarely on the side of the Ukrainians. And yes, we should be providing Iron Dome, and we should be providing early warning systems. We should be providing cyber capabilities to the Ukrainians. I don't know whether they're going to win or not. To me, in terms of Israel, we have to be able to look ourselves in the mirror and say that we did everything to help this country. And by the way, the Ukrainians living in Israel, Russians are not pro-Putin.
Right.
It's interesting. You'd think that no, not at all. And the people I got the most support from were for the Russians and the Ukrainians in Israel.
You mentioned, Michael, the way in which the Biden administration is sort of staving off the progressive wing of the Democratic Party related to Israel. But this questioner says, can Israel survive in spite of American Jewry and its move to the progressive left?
Yossi.
Which is a Yossi question, but I want to, you can answer this question.
I'll ask about Ukraine. You asked about American Jews.
You can answer this question, but I'd also like to have a twist to it, which is, they're asking, can Israel survive in spite of American Jewry and its move to the progressive left? And I would ask you to also think about whether there's any way in which that move is helping Israel, is helping the debate, is helping keep people honest.
Look, I'm worried about two things in the future of the Israeli-American Jewish relationship. And I'm not worried principally about the impact on Israeli security, about a lessening of American Jewish support. My concern is coming out of a Klal Yisrael commitment, the commitment to the Jewish people. It's a Jewish people issue. It's not an issue about Israeli security, first and foremost. I think Israel will survive if we manage to remain an intact society. We'll survive. That's the existential threat. It's Iran. We can handle Iran. We can handle a reduction in American support. I don't want it to happen, but we can deal with that. What worries me about the viability, the long-term viability of the American Jewish-Israeli relationship is what's happening to American Jews and what's happening to Israelis. If you think of the two flags on the bima of most American synagogues, those two flags represent a statement that Israel as a Jewish state, as a democratic state, is compatible with the values that American Jews hold. Now, what we're doing on both sides of the relationship is starting to unravel the two flags, the entwinement of Jewish state and democratic state. In America, more and more young Jews, and not only young Jews, on the left, are beginning to feel squeamish about a Jewish state. Is it democratic? Is it legitimate? There is a growing movement of renouncing what was a fundamental given for 3 generations of American Jews. And on the Israeli side, we're seeing a rise of a repudiation of Israel as a democratic state. It's still not a majority, but it's not a fringe anymore either. It's a growing minority that repudiates that sees democracy as a burden. Here we are surrounded by enemies, and this is the Ben Gvir appeal. Democratic norms hamper our ability to defend ourselves. The Supreme Court is holding back the IDF, which is generally not true, by the way. But what worries me is that if we begin to renounce Israel as a democratic state, and American Jews begin turning from Israel as a Jewish state, then we have nothing left in common. There's no shared language. And those two flags are not long for the world either.
I see it not as a strategic question, but as a moral question. Again, 10 years ago, I came back from Washington and I met with our leaders, and I said, I got some bad news for you. The bad news is we're on our own. This is not the America you knew. You know, in 1982, I was in the siege of Beirut as a younger paratrooper, and we all knew that if Israel got into a bad scrape, Reagan would send the Marines to get us out. And he did, twice. The Marines aren't coming anymore. Not America, after Afghanistan, Iraq, is going to be focusing on itself. It's not going to want to be the policeman of the world. It can't even figure out how to police itself. And we're on our own. And I said, this is bad news, but it's also, we're not the same country we were. We're strong. We can stand on our own 2 feet. And I think now, 10 years later, that bad news again has percolated throughout our consciousness, and we understand that America is not what it was during the Reagan years, the Clinton years. It's going to be different. And so the question is whether Israel can survive without American Jewry. The question is, America can survive without America. There aren't American Jewries. That's a strategic issue. The moral issue, and I think Yossi's touching on it, is that what is Israel's responsibility as the self-proclaimed nation state of the Jewish people? What does that mean? We say it all the time, but we unpack it. Do we have an obligation for Jewish continuity, Jewish education? Do we have a responsibility, as I say in the book, to recognize the legitimacy of the Reform and Conservative movement? By the way, it's a rather controversial position I took, because really nobody, even the previous government, didn't support that position, by the way, recognizing the Reform and Conservative movement. The fourth is that we are the nation state of the Jewish people, irrespective of how people practice or choose not to practice their Judaism, if you're part of our people. And we're not fulfilling that role. We're not now. It's not just a matter of democracy, Yossi, it's a matter of Jewish peoplehood.
Yes.
And so the moral question is much bigger here.
Yeah.
Right, and if Israel is not the nation state of the Jewish people, or if the American Jewish people cannot relate to the Israel that exists, then everything else kind of goes out the window about all the justifications for things or whatever.
Well, then we're a Mediterranean state that just happens to be
Nice,
Jewish.
yeah.
Okay, that changes our historical mission. We set out to create the nation state of the Jewish people, and it certainly exists that way in Israeli law. The question is, does it exist in Israeli practice?
Bear in mind that the threat that this government poses to Jewish peoplehood is that this is the first government that believes that Israel is the state of Judaism and not necessarily the state of the Jewish people. And the state of the Jewish people means the whole mess of the Jewish people.
Yeah.
And that there isn't any one particular version of Judaism that the state of Israel will enshrine. Now, of course, that's not a true statement because we have an Orthodox chief rabbinate.
Yeah.
But the counter to the Orthodox chief rabbinate is the law of return. The law of return is an anti-Orthodox law. And the Orthodox communities in Israel have been trying desperately for years to amend it. This government is going to try to amend the law of return, and that, I think, is the next great fight. After we fight over democracy, what is democratic Israel? The next fight is what is Jewish Israel.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask one more of these great audience questions.
I like
and
that.
then
I like that.
I wrote it.
I'm going to steal that. We steal from each other all the time. That's mine now.
So this is a good talk about gay rights in Israel now. It's Pride Month. We'll do just a quick one on that. That's a Michael question now.
No. I just we've prided. This is not play on word. We've prided ourselves for many years of being a leader in gay rights, and as an ambassador, I did a lot in that field. We do not have gay marriage because we don't have civil marriage. And civil marriage doesn't exist anywhere in the Middle East. And by the way, the biggest opponents of civil marriage in Israel would be the imams and the priests.
I remember there was
that.
a great story a colleague of mine did about, in Cyprus where all the Israelis go to get married, also all the Lebanese go. And so
they meet each other, they talk.
In Cyprus.
I still remember that story. It's a great story. It's just... that's going to be another front. It's going to be, whether Israel can remain that type of liberal society.
Given the increasing religious hegemony of the government.
I live in the Israeli state. He lives in the Jewish state. He lives in Jerusalem, and in the Israeli state of Tel Aviv was considered the most gay-friendly city in the world. And this week there's going to be 250,000 people. It's great for the hotel business too, and that's that. And then we do this with pride. Does that mean there are not challenges? There's going to be challenges, and there's going to be more challenges. There are going to be more challenges.
So I think we're going to close with this question, which is sort of a question and sort of a topic, which is you talk in your book about Israeliness and what that means to you, and I'm interested in hearing what it means to both of you. But I want to ask that by way of thinking about your own journeys, So you each grew up not far from here in two different directions and in two different
centuries.
two different planets.
I grew up in northern New Jersey. I could see Brooklyn from where I grew up, but I grew up in the 1950s happy days. He grew up in 17th century Brooklyn. So
This was pre-cool old Brooklyn.
Right.
My son is here.
Right.
And
so great that both your kids
he's a jazz drummer in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
There were no jazz drummers in the Brooklyn that I grew up in.
Even your old neighborhood is getting hip now, Yossi. But and then you both made Aliyah not all that far apart from each other, and each of you has traveled some distance politically, and you've become best friends, and you speak multiple times a day and edit each other's writing and all this stuff. So I don't know, I'd love to hear what you talk about. What does Israeliness mean to you, and also this little roadshow you have going here, this little friendship.
The overwhelming word for me is gratitude. Just gratitude. And gratitude to be part of a generation, even that has to deal with the most excruciating consequences of Jewish sovereignty. And it's an endless source of wonder for me to be alive at this moment as a Jew. And I can never for a moment take it for granted. And so gratitude, wonder, frustration, agony, it's all of those. It's so alive. There's nothing neutral or indifferent about being an Israeli. And I signed up for the roller coaster, and I knew exactly what I was getting into because I made Aliyah at the beginning of the first Lebanon War, the summer of 1982, when Michael was in Beirut. I was filing my immigration papers. And that was the first war that Israel lost, and we lost it because we were totally divided over that war. And so I was making Aliyah into a society that was tearing itself apart. And I'm very glad that I did, because I couldn't afford illusions. All of my starry-eyed Zionism, I had to leave it at the airport, because the Israel that I was entering was tearing itself apart. And so the Israel of today it really brings me back 40 years. And in some ways it's even more painful now. But I feel emotionally able to deal with it because I knew what I was signing up for, and because the stakes are so high, and because of what I owe Israel. What I owe Israel personally. I feel that Israel healed me as a Jew. I grew up, you alluded to the political journeys that Michael and I came. We came from very opposite places. Michael came from Hashomer HaTzair, which was the far left of the Zionist movement. I came from Beitar and then the Jewish Defense League, which was, of course, the far right. And what I feel Israel did for me was really, Zionism promised that it would normalize the Jews. I feel the state of Israel normalized me. As I know what Michael would say to that, but as normal as it's all relative.
Right.
But I do feel that where I started from as this traumatized son of a survivor family, and a very angry son of survivors, and seeing the whole non-Jewish world as enemy, Israel healed me. And so what I owe the state of Israel, I feel like I was an emotional refugee, even though I was coming from New York City. I was a psychological refugee. And in the same way that the state of Israel healed one wave after another of traumatized refugees, I feel that I was healed in a similar way.
I couldn't agree more. Gratitude is the overwhelming sense I have. I moved to Israel in the 1970s. There was nothing. There was, to call home to America, you had to take these huge bags of these metal tokens, a simonim, and sit there for hours at a payphone. And you could speak to your parents maybe once a month for $100 for 5 minutes. There was nothing. There was no food. Even the falafel was bad.
White cheese and yellow cheese.
That's right. White cheese, yellow cheese. That's what you had.
Noodles that turned yellow in the water when they boiled.
There was nothing. You had no central heating. That was the thing. You had to go out with 2 jerry cans down to the gas station
This is
and
the
fill
desert.
them
What
up
do
to
you
come
need
back
it
and
for?
light a little stove and hang over the stove. It was just, And I was a lone soldier, and there wasn't any hot water. You used to shower. You didn't shower in the army. You showered every 3 weeks when you came home, but there wasn't enough hot water to wash you and your uniforms. So I'd stick them all in the bathtub and then get into the bathtub with my uniforms and go like this. Okay, that was Israel in the 1970s. And you turn around.
Great music.
So it was great, but let's talk about the music, because your music is so important to you. I adore Israeliness. I adore even the people who won't let you pass them on the highway, because then they're a friar. Okay, if you pass them on the highway, that type of Israeliness doesn't drive you crazy. We have forged a nation. We forged a nation out of. In the face of impossible odds, out of vastly disparate peoples. And I think above all, we have assumed responsibility for ourselves. And someone says define Zionism. Zionism has one word. It's a synonym. It's called responsibility. Israel is the one place where we can take responsibility for ourselves. We're responsible for the electricity, we're responsible for the sewers, we're responsible for the mess of our governments. We're responsible. And I adore the responsibility. I look around me at people who agree with me, disagree with me, people who yell at me on the street because of Ukraine, and they say, we are all assuming responsibility in a way that Jews have not been able to respond for 2,000 years. And Jews, frankly, anywhere else in the world cannot assume those responsibilities to the same way. I grew up during the Vietnam period. You grew up during the Vietnam period. Do we know anybody who fought in Vietnam? No. Do we know anybody who hasn't fought in the state of Israel? Do we know anybody who hasn't lost loved ones fighting for the state of Israel in one way or the other? It's all part of the responsibility. Responsibility can be very painful. Many of you are parents. You know what this feels like, right? That's responsibility. To me, it is the ultimate zchut. It's the ultimate privilege. It's the ultimate bracha. It's the ultimate blessing to live in an era in which we can take responsibility for ourselves. And not just anywhere, but in our homeland, which has to be said. And the music and the food is outrageous today. So they have culinary tours of Israel. Whoever thought of culinary tours of Israel? That's crazy. We do it. And yes, it's painful. It can be. But it's beautiful pain, too. It is.
Well, thank you both very much. It's been a privilege to join you for your daily conversations. Michael is signing these books somewhere out there, I guess. Do you know where?
Thank you to the 2048 NGO, which is here. Eliovitz is over there. Say hi, Levi. If you have questions about supporting 2048, our goal is to get a national and international conversation going about our future and to address these questions. So come and join us.